Welcome everyone once again to Inside Asian Gaming's Trade Talk. My name is Ben Blashke, Managing Editor of Inside Asian Gaming, and very pleased today to be talking to none other than David Green. Of course, David is Principal of New Page Consulting, former Chairman of the Independent Gambling Authority of South Australia, and has worked very closely with the governments of Macau on liberalisation and the establishment of its gaming regulations there, and of course in Singapore. David, great to have you with us. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks, Ben.
So, David, lots to talk about. Of course, Crown Resorts have been in the news for, well, it seems like quite a few years now, and obviously in the middle of two Royal Commissions. We've been watching very closely the Royal Commission in Victoria over recent weeks, and over the past week, we saw a number of their board and senior executives take the stand. So, David, I guess there's been some pretty big questions thrown up. I mean, for a lot of this process, the possibility that Crown's casino license in Melbourne could be revoked was a chance, but I don't think we ever really thought it would happen. Seems to me that maybe now that's a little more likely than ever before. I mean, how do you read that situation now, given what we've seen over the past couple of weeks?
Well, certainly the material before the Royal Commission has been less than flattering to Crown and its management, both current and preceding management. However, we still need to wait on the decision that the Royal Commissioner himself makes in regard to whether to recommend cancellation or not. The interesting thing about the Royal Commission is that once it's convened, and it's convened by the governor rather than by the premier or gaming minister or anyone on the political side, it can't be stopped. So in effect, it has to run its course. He's been given extra time, as you know, an additional 3 months. And I think that further 3 months won't work to Crown's favour either, because there has been a lot of material which has been dredged up that didn't come out in the New South Wales inquiry, largely because it wasn't relevant to that inquiry. But in particular, the information regarding the relationship between Crown and the regulator. I think that's the most fundamental issue, and quite possibly the one where the public interest will be better served by not having Crown as licensee, rather than trying to find a workaround with that relationship currently.
So, I mean, that obviously brings us, David, to the question that a lot of people have been asking me over the past few days is, worst case scenario for Crown, what happens if Crown does lose its license?
Well, it's not a straightforward issue, as you might expect. One of the problems is that Crown actually owns a lot of the built infrastructure at South Bank. So it owns, I understand, 2 of the hotel towers. It may own the car park. It certainly has leases over other properties that are part and parcel of that development. Now, as you would expect, I suppose, government was very enthusiastic to have a casino appear in Victoria in the 90s. It was seen as potentially a driver of economic development and tourism, and it's proved to be both. However, there was no real advertence to what happens if the license doesn't simply expire, but has to be cancelled due to unsuitability on the part of the operator. And if you think about it, no casino operator anywhere in the world is going to take on board a destination casino unless they can either control access to hotels, food and beverage, retail, MICE facilities, and the casino itself, or secure that access through commercially realistic and favourable rates. To give you an example, should an operator come into the casino and wish to comp patrons' rooms, as is common everywhere, they may find that the transfer cost of doing that, if they don't control the hotel, makes it a prohibitive practice. And that then, of course, becomes a competitive disadvantage for that operator in marketing their casino. So that's got to be worked through. And I suppose you could consider a number of scenarios there. One might be that there's some sort of forced administration of the entire development. The government would be wanting to control that rather than leaving it in the hands of, for example, lenders who may have a right to appoint their own administrator if there happens to be covenant breaches and failures of repayment under the loan instruments. And Crown's already adverted to that prospect as recently as this past week, in fact. So if they were to be found unsuitable, the government would then have to decide, quite apart from how it gets control of the assets, apart from the casino, how it goes about marketing the opportunity to other casino operators. I think it would be ill-advised to simply look to a local operator to come in and take over. It would be far better to go to public tender and see what sort of interest could be dredged up. And then it could be cut to shape to fit the Victorian situation. One of the issues raised by the Commissioner himself during the week was the requirement for the casino to be controlled and operated in Victoria. And that, in fact, was a point of contention right from the first review of the licence by the then regulator back in, I think it was around 1999. So there's no clear pathway, is probably what I would have to summarise by saying. Whichever way you go is going to be complex, time-consuming and expensive.
Yeah, you raise a good point, David. As you say, it was discussed during this week about the fact that not only should Crown Melbourne's executive team and board be based in Melbourne, but any other property around Australia that they may have developed in future after Crown Melbourne should not be to the disadvantage of Crown Melbourne itself. So does that in itself make a little bit more tricky for, as you say, a Star or a Sky City, one of the other current Australian operators to step into that role, should a sort of a management role sort of become available for the Crown assets?
Yeah, I think it makes it particularly difficult for Star because there's also a competition issue that arises in terms of whether it unnecessarily restricts competition in the markets in which it operates. It would effectively have a monopoly of the entire East Coast. And assuming that Crown retained its licence in Perth, if you were to bundle all the assets in together, then that concern would be even stronger. Sky is a rather different animal in the sense that it only has operations in South Australia, in addition to its New Zealand operations. It may be prepared to look at relocating its head office to Melbourne in the event that it was to be favoured with the licence. Melbourne's got a bigger population than all of New Zealand, so it would make some sense if that was a barrier to it doing that, for it to say, well, we'll base ourselves in Melbourne. I mean, they're already dual listed on the ASX and the New Zealand Exchange. But I think, unfortunately, the regulator, in their initial review of the situation, didn't place sufficient emphasis on that requirement. And I think it was largely forgotten, in fact, until last week when the Commissioner himself raised it and said, well, what does this mean? What have I got to make of it when I'm framing my recommendations?
You also mentioned a moment ago, David, that in the letter that we became aware of last week that was sent by Crown's legal representatives to the gaming minister, Crown outlined various problems they saw with potentially losing their licence. They mentioned the number of employees they employ. They mentioned they could default on their loan covenants. And then also you mentioned before talking about the assets themselves. How much weight would the government put into these considerations if the Royal Commission, for example, recommended revoking the licence? Would the government potentially take some pause at that because of those issues, or would that be of no concern?
I don't think there's any such thing as being too big to fail. If you think back to Ansett Airlines in 2001, when it fell over, Lehman Brothers fell over. Sure, it precipitates a whole bunch of consequences, both foreseeable and unforeseeable, which politicians might prefer to avoid. But the fact of the matter is that operating Southbank is going to require that number of employees, irrespective of whether it's Crown or some third party. And similarly, if they generate the same level of income, the government is going to receive its revenue stream from the casino. In fact, based on the evidence before the Commission, it'll probably receive more because it may in fact be calculated correctly. So I don't think that's an impediment. I think what it is, in fact, is an opportunity for government to push the reset button, find an operator who is not only initially suitable, but is going to remain suitable, has a track record of suitability, is part of the community and prepared to take whatever steps are needed to integrate into the community, and who can operate that property without either borderline or complete illegality in its operations. The Commissioner himself made the observation again during last week that everywhere he looked, there seemed to be evidence of either illegality or misbehaviour of some sort, which suggests very strongly that he's just getting less impressed as time goes on with Crown's viability as an operator in Melbourne.
Yeah, and of course, David, you mentioned we saw the underpayment of tax. The way Crown was calculating deductions from tax payable was innovative, to say the least. Of all the things that we've seen over the past couple of weeks come out in this Victorian Royal Commission, do you think there's one thing in particular that the Royal Commissioner would be potentially most concerned with?
Yes, I do. I think that although he hasn't perhaps used the words, I think what he's really concerned about is, does the public interest require Crown to be removed? And in this regard, I look at their responsible gaming record. The evidence that was adduced about people playing literally to the point of exhaustion, both of capital and their physical being, is totally unacceptable in the community. And it's a community which was already in a schism, because you've always had the concerned sector, charities, religious groups, those morally opposed to gaming, and of course the advocates for gaming, including government, who were most enthusiastic to see a casino in the first place. So that schism is potentially widened when evidence like that is adduced before the Commission. The underpayment of tax, similarly. I mean, this is the casino licence is granted as a privilege. It's not granted as a matter of legal right. And Crown has effectively tried to convert it to a right, not only by obtaining an extension of the licence itself from 2033 to 2050 in exchange for a little more cash and some promises by government. But it's really shown itself to be willing to do almost anything to capitalise to the utmost on having that privilege. And one way that is manifested is that it's really worked to the disadvantage of vulnerable people and the government itself, which is quite ironic, actually.
Just before, David, I move on to my last couple of questions. One of the other issues that we've been brought up, well, it was brought up prior to this Royal Commission actually, but certainly the influence that Crown has had over the Victorian gaming regulator. And I think some of the accusations were that the Crown was, basically forced the regulator to be subservient to it. We learned this week there's going to be an independent investigation into, or inquiry launched into the gaming regulator itself. What changes do you think need to be made there?
The position of the regulator is a bit awkward because Crown, I'm sure, will argue that just by their lack of reaction to some of the things that happened, that could be taken as acquiescence. Now, I don't happen to agree with that because if you think, for example, about income tax, that's a self-assessment regime. No one's suggesting that the tax office is party to people avoiding tax simply because they are not complying with their obligations to faithfully report. But the way that that would normally be picked up is through audit or through disclosure by third parties who may be blowing the whistle. Now that blowing the whistle, of course, has happened with some of the former inspectors at VCGLR coming good during the week on the Four Corners program. And I think it's really at the point now where there's nothing that the regulator can do which is going to undo the damage that has been caused by what people are characterising as regulatory capture. So what do you do about it? Well, VCGLR didn't always exist. I mean, it's only existed in that form, I think, from memory since about 2012, when liquor was added to gaming. I regulated in an environment where that happened after I ceased to be a regulator, and resourcing is always going to be an issue. Liquor is far more difficult to police and enforce because there are so many licensees and so many different categories of license. The casino license is one license, but in terms of its importance, of course, it really should rank equally or even above liquor. But the tendency is to favour liquor because there's more that can go wrong because of the distributed nature of liquor licenses. People think that because Crown is a single property, it should be easily controlled. Well, I think the evidence now suggests that that's certainly not the case.
So, David, from Crown's perspective, they've obviously been working to satisfy some of the judgments from the Bergen inquiry, or some of the findings from Bergen. We've seen 5 or 6 directors step down. They've started refreshing their board as well. We've seen Steve McCann come in as well as CEO. So, and I think they announced a certain number of people now that they've brought on to oversee or help with AML and compliance and that sort of thing. So Crown will argue that they're already well on their path to transformation, but have they done enough in your eyes to show that they're learning from their mistakes?
No, I don't think they have. I think the fundamental issue is that this misbehaviour, to want of a better term, has been ongoing for a long period of time. There have been numerous contributing factors to it, which have been to do with the ownership and control of the group, some of the management of the group. It's really pushed the envelope in terms of ethical business practice. Its failures to comply well and truly now in stone. People know what has happened. And the issue now is, can you really revive an organisation with that sort of track record? It would be rather like bringing back to life Pyramid Building Society, which was a very famous corporate failure in Victoria years ago, where The entity failed. It failed to secure public confidence, and that was the end of it. It never reappeared. And I think the same would be perhaps the case with Crown, that the problems are so integral and deep-seated that I don't think changing people is going to make any short-term difference. There'll be a lot of knee-jerk reaction and so on, but if you think about it, Crown got to this situation because of hubris. It got there because it believed it was bigger than the game. It was able to influence the political conversation around it and its operations. It could control the regulator, and it could appoint a board which was always eclectic, but very rarely strong in gaming. So how do you rectify all of those things? Changing the people is a good start, but without really some fundamental change, and by that I mean simply eliminating Crown altogether, I just don't see that there's a likelihood that anyone's going to be very satisfied.
Yeah, I mean, one of the people, possibly the only person that's still there, has been through all of this is Helen Coonans, of course, David. She stepped up to the executive chair role earlier this year on a temporary basis. So she said she will step down at the end of this year, but there are calls now after her testimony this week that perhaps that should happen a bit earlier. What are your thoughts on Helen's future?
I think she certainly doesn't have a future in terms of looking out more than 3 to 6 months. I have no reason to reflect adversely on her or her character at all. But I do wonder why it was that she took over an executive role when it would have been possible to promote an executive internally to take the CEO position, even on an acting basis. She has no established experience in gaming. Her background is in politics, not in corporate world, although she has been on several notable boards. But it's a vast jump to go from serving on a board to running the company and chairing the board. I mean, it certainly doesn't meet any best practice guidelines that I'm aware of. I know circumstances didn't favour another solution from within the board, because the board at that time was down to 3 people and a dead man walking. So given that, they really should have, I think, looked at perhaps putting somebody in on an interim footing and leaving her to do what she needed to do, which was try and restructure, reorganise, and re-equip the governance of the company. But I don't see how a director of 10 years standing, who was there when it all happened, and who knows what was said, when it was said, why it was said, how she can survive very much longer.
Yeah, David, I'm quite sure it's going to be a very busy and probably quite an anxious few months for Crown heading towards the end of the year. And I think mid-October is when the report from the Royal Commissioner is due to be handed down. So look, I'm sure we'll speak again before then, David, but once again, thanks for joining me today. And
thanks, Ben.
Yeah, and for all our viewers, look forward to seeing you on the next edition of Trade Talk.